Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Voice for Anyone Everywhere panel at the L3-AI conference. I'm Artie Merritt, one of the co-founders and CEO of Dashbot. I'm here with Joan from Versa and Emily from VoiceFlow. And we'll start off just by having them do quick intros. Joan, if you want to start.
Oh, sure. Hi, my name is Joan. I am the head of conversational research at Versa, which is the largest voice agency in the world. I'm also the CEO and founder of Women in Voice. Emily?
Yeah, well, great to see you, Joan. My name is Emily. I'm head of growth at VoiceFlow, also a proud member of Women in Voice. And I lead all of growth, partnerships, and community activation on the VoiceFlow team.
Great. So maybe just to get started, what kind of use cases are you seeing folks building for voice? Are there things that you see working well for a voice interface? And we can start with perhaps Emily with VoiceFlow.
Sure. So for context, VoiceFlow is a tool that lets anybody design, prototype, and build voice apps with little to no code. So we see a ton of different use cases. From our side, being a build tool and a design tool, we see everything from people who are just jumping into it and are just trying to figure out what can they accomplish with conversation, design, and AI, to large companies who are now trying to figure out new channels that they can start to explore, new ways that they can dive into user experiences that were previously unavailable, and also just experimenting in a lot of cases with mainly communication in ways that they can engage their customer base. So things from like productivity apps to checking up on statuses, one-line commands, and optimizations to entertainment and beyond.
Awesome. Yeah, not so dissimilar here, or I mean, with voice, you can build for anything, right? I mean, I think we know that mostly. At Versa, we have done a lot of work with companies like Domino's and Huggies and Coca-Cola. So we work with some really big brands. But we've also been doing a lot of mental health work and medical use cases more recently, as well as customer service. As with the pandemic, there have been so many escalations that are extremely costly. And so doing some analyses for companies and saying, you know, this is right now costing you like X number of Teslas per month. Like if we can cut that down by using, different multimodal tools, how could that dramatically help businesses stay afloat? So even though it's not the sexiest vertical, customer support has been a really big one right now.
And that's a good point. We also see quite a bit of increased interest around coronavirus and all. Mm-hmm. Are these interfaces, are they the voice through, say, Alexa or Google, or it's through is it mobile apps, or what other interfaces are they doing it for?
Well, and I think the interesting thing with Versa is we are a platform agnostic. We partner with all the big tech companies, but we really build custom designs for whatever our clients need. So we definitely build on Google Assistant, on Alexa. We build on different Microsoft omnichannel things. But it's really what fits for our clients. I think really what's cool is we have talent in the voice space. So I actively work with designers and make sure it's data driven, as I'm the researcher on the team. Does that answer your question, Artie?
Oh yeah, definitely. No, that's helpful. Emily, anything like that for yourself, or is it still more Alexa and Google Assistant, or do you guys?
Yeah. So what we mainly see for those who have built, and I definitely echo Joan's point, where there's been a lot of experiences that are being built to help optimize existing flows like customer support and service, and especially with telehealth. And healthcare, I think, has really seen a huge spike in people's adoption and understanding of it, which has led to a lot of building. But I think on our side, we mainly see a ton of influx on people who build and host on us for Alexa and Google, because those are our one-click integrations. But also, like, very commonly in the prototype stage as well, where people are sharing those and using that also for widgets, for embeds, for other form of conversation design.
Right. That was part of a discussion where folks were talking about not just the Alexa and Googles, but using voice for, say, calling the elevator, or using the ATM, just especially in this environment right now when you're not wanting to touch anything. So there's some pretty interesting things out there. It kind of leads to another question here is, perhaps I should have actually started with, voice is one of the hottest topics right now in this conversational space. And sometimes we hear this term, voice first. Starting with that, is back when mobile started first taken out, people would say mobile first instead of building for the web. What is like you guys' feelings around that? Like, as a voice first strategy, is that what you're sort of supporting too, or how do you feel about that type of phrase?
I'll take that one. Voice first. I mean, I want to make jokes like I'm a voice influencer, but I don't believe that our future is just black boxes. Yeah. I really think that it depends. The build should fit the use case. I think for simple answers, or sometimes medical devices, you just want a number or you just want an answer. But most of the integrated builds I see, the builds of the future, are really multimodal. So I don't know that it makes sense that everything is voice first. I feel the hype, I feel the excitement, but I really want to make sure it matches what is going to be retained by users. I see people buying certain IoT and then they give it up really fast. And I think the things that we are building into our lives have visual components, have different other components that really keep us there and retain users. But I'd be curious to hear what you think, Emily. Same, different?
Yeah, I definitely echo in the sense where, like, I as someone who's in the voice space and who really loves seeing people being able to achieve things there, I do strongly believe that there's a place where the user experience is going to be a one-line command, something that's a quick and easy solution, and that's going to be a voice only or just a quick voice exclusive version of that experience. But I think multimodal and multi-platform is going to be really where voice takes off, where voice is always going to be a faster input in a lot of cases. Like, even taking the example of like Uber, where like you saying like, I need a ride to go X, is way faster than you opening up your phone, typing that in, awkwardly looking at the differences in between Uber X and whatever else. But in terms of actually engaging with a lot of information or consuming, you need that other side of it, where the visual components is going to create more way for more advanced, more complex, and back and forth conversation that I think is really going to be important for this industry.
Absolutely. And just things like working memory, like keeping all that in your head, retaining it. And we know multi-turns are also one of the hardest problems. How easily can you break a skill or action by trying to do a sophisticated multi-turn right now? So I think, and just to be clear, I've been told that we're not using big jargon. Multimodal in this case is thinking about different inputs and outputs to a system, that you could have, voice as an input, you could have, a toggle as the output, that we are using different modalities. So if anyone's listening that doesn't use that term on the reg, that is what that's about.
Yeah, or it would be the solution to even what Artie had just mentioned with the elevator situation. That would be a good example. Yeah.
Exactly.
It definitely, we see the same thing. It's multimodal. Folks are building for multiple interfaces, and voice is a component of that. It all goes back to, why are you building one of these interfaces? What's it supposed to do, or what's the purpose? And but actually, I guess one of them too, and Joan brought up, is related to like the context, like keeping that in memory. When I guess maybe it's the next step is, how do you go about, say, building a voice interface? Like, what are things that clients, like your brands or enterprises, should be thinking of when if they came to you to say, hey, we want to build a Alexa skill, we want to build some new voice interface? Yeah,
well, I look at the data. That is, Artie and I think would agree on that one. What do you see your users doing? I can't say the client name, but I was looking at some client data recently, and just like, they have 17 use cases they built out, and like 52% of the user base is using 3 of them. And I was just like, we need to make sure those 3 are premium, phenomenal experiences. The other ones are important, but like, really think about what your users are coming for, and designing for those things. I think you also mentioned, kind of, as we talk about multi-turns, what those slot values are. Don't make your user repeat right? If you already have the information from an authenticated user, retaining that information and kind of working on personalization overall. So start with the data is what I would say.
How about yourself, Emily?
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I think that especially if you're a company that's looking at it, like you should have data on what are the channels that are most successful with your user base? What is the communication style? How have you already built those up? Because I think that as a launch pad is often the case that is necessary to be successful, at least when you're a business that's kind of diving into things for the first time. But beyond that, I think like a big thing that we go through when we talk to people is really trying to get them out of this idea of, I have this existing thing that works well on my desktop or in my web app, and I'm just going to shove it into this voice experience, and it's going to be great. Like it's going to be exactly the same. And I think we made that mistake in virtually every interface shift that we've ever come across, with mobile just being like a shrunken version of an entire desktop page, to even now where people talk often about just taking the entire robust web app that they've built, I don't know, maybe like for the last 5 years, and they just shove it into something that has no visuals. That's not great. That's not built with the proper UX standards in mind. And it's not going to be good at proving your case for this channel as well. So I think we spend a lot of our time advocating for that, and really trying to educate new users on what is proper conversation UX design and practices.
Absolutely. And I totally resonate with those assets. I love when people are like, I'm just going to, the response is going to be what we copy from the website. And it's a whole paragraph that's super wordy and nasty. And you're like, no one's going to listen for 2 minutes to the answer for that. Like really how we translate material, and do you need visuals in this new world? I think it's not an easy problem, but it's a really important problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we hear the same thing, and I'm actually guilty of the one part of that. I just wanted to have an Alexa skill just as a demo, to use something as a demo, and you could ask it, tell me about Dashbot, and there'd be like a one sentence. If someone asked me that in an email, I'd send over this one sentence, but even if three words into it, I'm like, stop, this is too long, right? Which actually kind of leads to a good, maybe perhaps segues. How do you start structuring these conversations? Like, are there tips? We've heard people acting them out, like have someone be the Alexa, someone be the person. What are some of the ways you go about designing the conversations?
Ooh, gosh. Emily, you want to start that off?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure Joan's going to have different ones from working with clients all the time. That adds a different element to it. But what we've definitely seen is a series of different things, from like Wizard of Oz testing, where people do pretend to be the device and do live tests by speaking. Other ways that we do that is, for instance, like for our tool, we do have a prototype function where you can test the skill and kind of get a gist of how long or how awkward some of your answers may be if you've just ported them over, which tends to help. But I think in terms of more simple ways of just describing how you can better set yourself up for success, is we've done small things like try it out in a text message. Like, how would you say that to a friend versus writing that very polished if it was on a landing page or something like that, because that reads and that response is very different. And even more higher level ideas of just trying to get people to shake that idea of being very polished and rigid in how they write their responses if they're not, let's say, a healthcare provider or a bank or those types of experiences, is even just making the distinction between writing an essay versus reading an essay. There's like those differences are totally contextually based. So you're going to need to be thinking about that when you're doing your testing, when you're writing in the first place, and that will make that testing environment much easier.
Absolutely. I resonate with a lot of that material. I think the key thing for me is kind of agility and iteration, like just knowing that the first thing you spit out is not going to be the thing you probably keep. I would say alignment. As Emily mentioned, like we have a lot of clients who some are super hands-on and they want to hear every interaction, and some that are super hands-off, but knowing that you're aligned on is the persona far more professional for medical context? Is it far more playful and irreverent from an entertainment one? I think really being thoughtful, and I it might sound silly, but really saying it aloud. Like when you read it, you interact with it in a different way. Hearing it aloud, you're like, ooh, that sounds really clunky. Like I would never, that doesn't fit with what I'm really hoping for. And so I think, although it might sound comical, can be really, really powerful to iterate with your team and hear things aloud together, things that are working and things that are totally not.
Yeah.
Speaking of
Sorry.
go ahead. Oh no, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm like, to echo Joan's point on literally like your first draft, like your mock, if you are trying to create one of these things, is really being able to say these things aloud. In the same way that we expect mocks from graphic designers or from UX flows or things like that, like there's one thing to be able to give basically a visual map of what that looks like, but that's not actually how people will be engaging with it. So the mock in this way is really trying to translate what that looks like. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be speaking. And it doesn't need to be, I think that it's going to take some time, but I think people are getting there now.
Mm-hmm. And keeping good copywriters. There's so many people who come from theater backgrounds and screenwriting, and they do extremely well in conversational design. So I think just really valuing that creative juice talent. That is not my strong suit. So, partner, but I'm not your designer necessarily always.
Yeah, we hear the same thing too. It's this basically a whole new role here around this voice UI or VUI designer. And exactly what you just mentioned, that a lot of the screenwriters, folks with those comedy backgrounds or in the TV movie industry do really well. There's a couple folks that we often have involved in these kind of conversations. That one's an Emmy Award winning screenwriter, and this is it definitely helps. We touched upon, or maybe think about, is we say hearing the conversations. How do you feel about using the built-in voice of these devices versus having have a custom voice of your own? Do those when do you use one or the other, or any thoughts along that?
Well, it's kind of a spicy question, or like a lot of companies have huge financial stakes in the answer to that exact question.
Yeah.
I will say that some customers, we usually do a price comparison for them and say, you say you want a custom voice. Do you realize it's going to be X amount more dollar, or we're going to have to negotiate with these companies to make sure we get a talent for you, especially if it's a multi-year project, being really thoughtful about that. I really think it depends on a lot of factors. And I mean, there's such flexibility with having, an Alexa voice, but does it fit all the contexts? I mean, even with, Polly, there are companies like Well Said Labs that are working on this problem specifically, like customized voices that are not crazy prices, that really sound naturalistic and not getting someone in the lab to speak for 70 hours and pay significant amount of money. So it's a evolving answer, I would say. What do you think, Emily?
Yeah, I think that we're at the beginning stages of really trying to figure out basically what like CSS for voice is. Like, how can we take this base of voice and really trying to make it into something else? And I think SSML is starting to get into that, but it still feels as though, and for context, for those who are unfamiliar with SSML, we refer to that as like CSS for voice. So you can stylize it a little bit, but it still sounds a little robotic. It still sounds like very clearly an AI. And I think that the more that we start to work on this, and the more that there are companies that are innovating in that space, it's going to become more accessible for people to be able to customize a voice to a degree where it sounds unique to their brand or to their experience. And we've even seen that in the evolution of how companies use Twitter as an example. Like, that Wendy's is funny versus like the US bank probably isn't. So those are, I think, elements that are going to become more important. But right now, I think that there's like context, and to Joan's point, there's going to be different experiences that just need custom voices right now, or voice actors. Like an entertainment game or a storytelling application is probably not going to be as good as delivered with Alexa or Google's base voice. And I think we're seeing more and more of a mix in that, and more people getting more creative. But I'm excited to see more independent assistants come up, and as well as more companies, even like Descript, who are able to take samples of people's voice and turn that into something.
Absolutely. Well, and I think something that's come up that's interesting to me also is, I think there's a kind of a gold standard of wanting to sound human-like and kind of the Turing test-ish. But I've actually talked to some clients in medical contexts where they prefer it to sound more like a machine, to differentiate, to make sure that people know that they're speaking to a machine in like an ICU environment, which was kind of interesting to me, being like, oh, I default to assuming we want to sound like a human. Whereas they're like, we want to know that Alice is actually the robot, like, because there's so much noise and chaos going around. So I think it's really, that pushed me to think about what is the correct fit for this use case.
Yeah, definitely. Like even to that point, exactly. I used to run a conversation bot team at a legal tech company before this. And at that legal tech company called Clio, we experimented so much with the barriers of what people are willing to engage with the bot on, where it was something as simple as, if I had a bot icon on it, they were very risk averse to it, because legal is a little averse to some automation and some tech. However, if I made it too human, where it was a person's face and a person's name, they would get very mad at that bot if it was still learning, versus just adding bot in that name, but having a human style avatar ended up becoming like this perfect medium for that specific industry. Whereas I think that, to your point on that, there's going to be industries that need that type of separation from a human, versus ones that are more naturally a human engaging type of environment. They're going to need that that extra level of customization.
Right. And we've been defining the Uncanny Valley, right? Like where we hit on those.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's a human or not. And I think that's shifting, you know, as we, you know, I ran a test a few years ago looking at how comfortable are you? How often do you speak to these type of devices? And as that's shifting with consumer behavior, where the correct line is, I think will be shifting also. So I hope we continue to have white papers on this, is my hope.
This is great. I mean, you're touching upon so many different avenues of building upon voice. There's all sorts of things I'd like to go deeper into. There's
sure.
You know, the personality around this. You brought up things around the context and remembering, you know, what people have said before. These are all really valuable things for folks building voice interfaces, but perhaps because you're on the topic of like the using a custom voice and all, maybe you can chat a bit about personality. Like, how do you go about thinking about what personality should this voice skill have, or you know, when is it okay to have one or not, or Well,
I think the key thing, or I hear a lot of debate about this, which kind of shocks me, but like there is no personality by design, or like you could have a null personality, which is just not correct. Like you're basically having the personality of your writer is the answer, you know, is the default. So I think it's really important, even if it's in broad strokes, as Emily was mentioning, you know, is this a playful, funny one that goes for Wendy's? You know, is it a more serious one for a legal or more medical context? My team actually has like we have a template. It's internal, so I don't think I can share it, but we have different words, and we as a team align on where it fits along a spectrum, and really, and making our own mock, and then showing it to the client and saying, do you agree with this? Does this fit with where you think the team thinks that the persona should be? And really matching that up with how our content writer writes out the conversational flows. So that's from very early on in the design process. Emily, throw it to you.
Yeah, I think that it also depends on kind of how much of that personality is already built into their brand. So like if you take an example of like, let's say like Orbitz Insurance, like everyone pictures Flo, that girl with like the flipped hair and a headband, and she's like kind of sassy. I would imagine that their bot would be like that, because they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, my assumption, in building that. So being able to serve that up and being able to create a persona that matches that or doesn't deter from that, I think is important. Versus like if it's an informational bot, you probably want to be more serious about the tone, more matter of the fact, less flowy, or less free with the extra words that are in there, because people really are probably in a different state of mind. So I think also matching that to what is the context when someone actually comes into interaction with that conversation is also very important. So you're never going to write in the same tone if you want to compare it to things that are more digital. Like you'll never write in the same tone in your email as you will on your landing page, as you will on your support pages, or God forbid, like your cancellation page.
Right.
So really thinking about where that is, I think also helps to inform that. And I think like other ways of thinking about it is it's not just about customizing the bot itself. It's also like the elements surrounding that or the layers in that sound. So if you think about like an audiobook versus a podcast as an example, I can't stand audiobooks personally for that long because I get bored out of my mind because there's like no music or like banter or things like that. However, fundamentally, you strip it down, it's still someone who's talking with like no visual. So ear cons or audio files or things like that, or even background noise can also help to add atmosphere or personality as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, all this encompasses like sonic branding, right? When some companies have, audio cues or there's already a soundscape that goes along with them. And some of them are defining that or have to look at a branding suite, just like you'd have a color palette, that goes along with your company. Like you need to have a sonic environment. And I think also, Emily, just thinking about genre and register, right? Like which medium are we looking at? What is the register of the formality of the tone? I think, or at least my linguistic chops come out and be like, this is what, any composition teacher is thinking about on a regular basis when you're writing for a recipe versus a poem, versus a, romantic letter. I don't know. But really thinking that it really matches, right? Because the technical support would be different from an introductory, you just signed up kind of information. So yeah, really great things to think about. Artie?
Oh, no, this is great. We've touched upon a bunch of different things. There's one that I want to go into maybe a little bit, is the context. I mean, and you touched upon a bit around remembering what people have done. I think that's quite important for folks to know when they're building voice. So not starting people over at the beginning each time they come in. Is there other things around that context or other tips that come to mind for folks that are building for voice?
Yeah, I mean, I really think about I love breaking systems and just testing how sophisticated they are today. Because the thing is, I use my Google Assistant almost every day, and they change it almost every, they're iterating and deploying so often. But I mean, just keeping slots. So for example, I can ask like, what's the weather report for this week? And then I ask something like, what about Wednesday? Or what about Wednesday night? And suddenly it breaks and says, what are you talking about Wednesday night? Whereas if the topic is weather, right? Like if we're staying in the context of that main topic, asking a follow-up about specific times, it has that data set that it's calling, right? Like it should be able to do that, but potentially it's not keeping the questions this is situational design, right? Where we're thinking about in this situation, is it keeping these different slots? Is it able to run these multi-turns? And I think thinking about variables, thinking about slots, thinking about different ways people might say it, right? I think that's an extremely difficult problem we're all working on. If you say sure, or people say different things from yes, right? Yeah. There's just so much variation. I think that goes back to my iteration one. It's like the thing you first deploy, hopefully is not the thing you keep. Because if you look at your data, you'll find drop-off points. You'll find things that are glitchy that do not work for you. So I think just really, again, look at your data, data set. What about you, Emily?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people go into this type of design with their happy path in mind. So their ideal scenario where everything goes right. And everyone's like, that must be the hardest part because that's what they spend most of their time thinking about. Whereas like 90% of the work is like trying to get them back to that path and like scramble to see what went wrong. And I think that like very high level, what we always tell people to do is the very first thing you should do when you set up your conversation design is build your help path. If something breaks, there better be a message that says like, oh, something's gone wrong, like try again. Like rather than in, let's say, web design or an app design, that you get hit with the 404 or very clearly like the spinny wheel of death, you can't get that visual cue with voice. It just goes silent. and people go crazy when they ask a question and there's nothing. So building that, I think, first is really important. Second is really trying to build or think about your first repair path. Where are all the possible ways that people can break off, and how do you get them back? So we always think about it as like a rule of three. What happens the first time that someone, they mishear something, switch up the second time that happens, and then third time, admit defeat or try something different. And I think, to Joan's point, I think the synonyms and the way that we're now starting to think about, because it's voice, like localization, tone, jargon, what are the specifics of that? I think there's starting to become more emphasis on that. And I think we're going to start to see more plugins, libraries, more open source documentation around that is going to make that part easier.
Definitely. And I think reprompts. Oh, if I can.
Oh,
yes.
go ahead.
Or,
Yeah,
I feel like I keep cutting you off.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, Emily, you're talking about sophisticated, don't say, oops, can you say that again? Oops, like that is going to frustrate your user. But I've definitely seen systems. I was shocked. I thought it was a joke. But like 80% of the system was rerouting, reprompt support in a sophisticated way. 80% of the system, right? Like on the back end, looking at the architecture. But I think one of Scott Gantz, who now is working at Apple, so of course he doesn't talk to us no more, but he has talked about bringing in your unhappiest users, bringing in your angry, pissed off users and learning from them. Like instead of, pushing them away, being like, I really want to listen to you, and curating the system and learning what escalations, really bad ones, look like, can make the whole system better. And I thought he was totally joking, like, what? Bringing in angry users, like listening to them? That sounds like a nightmare for UX. But really, I think he has learned so much from those users, and really making sure that when things go wrong, we know how to make it hopefully go right, and bring them back, and retain those users. I think I've especially interacted with brands that I'm having real problems. I'm like, I sent this ticket 3 weeks ago, why hasn't this been fixed? I'm so annoyed. And they say, hey, we hear you, and being really, I trust those brands. I feel much better about, wow, you really know how to take care of your customer, and you want to retain your customer, and you say sorry and you make it right. I mean, I think it can be really helpful for a lot of brands, but really being sophisticated in that help, I completely agree.
Definitely.
I think just like one last point on that. Sorry, Artie.
Oh, no. It's it's about you all. I don't want to hear from me.
In that, I think there's, for me at least, it's really difficult to go and test a lot of voice experiences to the point where you get into that resurrection, like D-Day mode, because there's like an endless amount of possibilities and how you could possibly end down that bad path. And I think for people who are really looking to get more information on that, I think looking up like resurrection funnels of companies. So this is like my inner growth experimenter that comes out, but looking at resurrection funnels. So what happens when someone has churned? How do companies get them back? So that's like your D-Day customer, the absolute hardest to convince. How have companies done that previously? How can you learn from that, take elements and put that into your conversational flows? I think is really important. And to Joan's point, like if you're not talking to your early customers that are going through this flow, you're not really readying yourself to iterate correctly. And just how you would learn from any like product launch or beta or anything that you would do on any other platform, you have to do with this too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for us, we often say it's hard to build for these environments because you don't know all the things people might say to the interface and how they might say it. And you touched upon this. That's where the shameless plug for myself is using some form of analytics to see how people are saying it. So then if you see the mishandled, unhandled intents, you can come back and decide whether you want to add support for that or how do you get people back on a happy path, all those things. Yeah, this is actually quite interesting. The other thing you talked about was the, different languages and some of the terminology. I remember early on, we were chatting with these folks that were building I think it was an Alexa skill for reminding you to take medication, but Alexa couldn't, some of these the names of the medicines,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't know those. So they had to basically make their own phonetic dictionary if they saw something, I think they said let the door was Lipitor or something like that.
Ooh.
So it was that kind of craziness.
I have a story about that actually, or specifically about demographic. I mean, I think collecting and thinking about demographic data can be problematic, but if you are doing it in a ethical way, I previously did, this was a long time ago, this was like during my PhD before Nuance, I was helping out a medical system. Their current rates were like a D, and they're like, why are we not going well? Can you help with some technical road mapping? And I said, it was a very similar one, Artie. Like, I was like, so what's the grammar? Like, what did you build in? They're like, oh, we threw in a regular API. I was like, for a medical system? Like prescriptions, like these super polysyllabic weird words, like what? Uh-oh. And then I asked, like, who's using your system? Who is your most of your demographic? And they're like, ooh, healthcare providers, carers, supporters. And actually for that system, it was a lot of like Filipino nurses. And I was like, wait a minute, you put in like a regular API and you like tons of Filipino nurses saying like prescriptions. Like, of course you're getting a D. You really need to think about what is the input, what is the output? Does it match your data set? And like none of these are matching up whatsoever. And I thought it was just really powerful that these are data scientists, these are engineers, and yet it was still not matching up. So that was a few years ago. Hopefully we're not making those same mistakes, but really thinking about what your grammar is. And that's just not medical things. That could be a list of products, right? That could be different dialect support and so forth.
I think like where I see even like English native speakers make mistakes in creating those types of mishaps, or even in like acronyms. So for instance, we built a voice wiki skill to help onboard new people onto our team, because there's a ton of new words that you need to learn in order to be good in conversation design or understand it. And one of the first things that we realized is, let's say we put an API as an example, or like VUI. We have to like actually type out VEE, like or phonetically, like how would we say VUI, or how would we say API, versus just having that in there because it'll be pronounced like happy or things like that. And like those are very easy mistakes to make, especially when you're building something and that's such a tiny component. Or
and I
even,
would actually, if I can even push back a little bit, I don't believe that users make mistakes. I think the system isn't designed for them, actually. Or like I've heard that before, like, oh, my users keep making mistakes using my product. And I know it's not an easy problem, but like if 70% of your users are making mistakes, I think it's actually the user flows that might need to be iterated. Or I hear this a lot, and I'm just like, because I think even most of my company at Versa is based in Australia, and we've had such troubles with, as you mentioned, with API. How do you say that in Australia? How do you say that in New Zealand, the United States? Like there is variation that can be significantly different. I sometimes struggle to understand my colleagues. I'm like, okay, can you explain that idiom? Like, I've never heard that one before. Like, we technically are all speaking English, but we're native speakers of different dialects, or we're multilingual speakers, which adds even more variation, which honestly is the norm. If you look at the demographics of the United States, most of us come from lots of different backgrounds. So, but yeah, excuse me to push back on that, but I think what mistake is or isn't can be problematized.
Oh yeah, I meant that more on building. Yeah, I meant that more on like the building side, where it's kind of one of those things, as someone who is a conversation designer, we know that unfortunately we're not at that stage yet with NLU or NLP, where they are able to like very easily handle those types of requests. So we kind of it's very easily forgotten to go put in that repair path there, or put in that synonym phonetically. So keeping that in mind, if you're handling any of those types of requests or any of those types of asks.
This has been great for learning all about like tips and techniques for building for these interfaces. I'm curious, just maybe a little bit of a switch here is, how are people finding these interfaces, like the user acquisition, discovery, user adoption? Like, are there any tips you have around that, like what could actually help increase adoption or anything along those lines.
You want to take that one, Emily?
Yeah, sure. There's definitely a ton of different ways that you can. In a lot of cases, I think people default to assuming that like the marketplace will serve as your number one way of discoverability. However, because it's still pretty nascent and because people are still trying to figure out and carve out what are the leaders in there, and voice SEO is kind of still a little bit of a question mark for a lot of people, I think that it's really important to leverage parallel channels or different channels that people are already living on. I've seen people get really crafty on Reddit. I've seen community groups, like we have one for VoiceFlow where we see people sharing apps that they've built all the time in there and requesting users or feedback, to getting mailing lists and creating landing pages for that the same way you would generate eyes or views for your product. I think that really detaching it from this idea of the marketplace is going to be my one-way ticket into fame and my one-way ticket into discoverability, you have to treat it like you would any other product that you're building. You need to think about the same type of strategy, whether you're using community groups or setting up a landing, cookieing them, doing your typical type of digital marketing or outreach, I think is very helpful.
Yeah, discovery right now I think is a huge problem, or certainly not one that we've all solved. And I think thinking about the hustle and thinking about what traditional marketing and how you have to get your product out there is a totally valid comparison. And I think I'm a little nervous, honestly, about voice SEO because of the potential gatekeeping that can happen with search engines and how that will evolve, especially as I think, or Google integrated their Google Assistant into their interfaces, and they report that over 20 to 30% of users are using voice query to get to the at least top hit or few hits. So I think really thinking about your keywords, thinking about customizing, partnering with said search engines, but being prepared to work hard at this discovery. And I think that also relates to retention, how difficult it is, how cumbersome. Definitely relates to acquisition. Well, I think another thing just related to user experience, I was talking to my colleague who works in India, and he's like, I don't know exactly why. Like, he tries out all the IoT. He buys literally everything. And he's like, I like my Google Assistant better. It just feels comfortable. I don't know how to define it, but like, that's the reason why I use that one of all my different tools I could use. And I think it's those, I mean, I would make him define it. I'm a researcher. Define the KPIs. But really knowing that plays, those little choices we make end up compounding and being some of the reasons why we retain users more readily than not. So I think that discovery, acquisition, adoption, longer tail retention is really important.
Yeah,
I think just like,
sorry.
Yeah, sorry. In terms of like early tips as well, is like, it's very important that you choose an invocation name that's easy to say and is easy to remember. We came into that issue even when we first launched VoiceFlow. Actually, at one point was a voice application. We did interactive children's stories for Amazon Alexa. Fun fact. And we started off as Fable, and no one could pronounce Fable, or it couldn't be heard correctly. So we kept getting all of these like missed requests, or people weren't able to actually readily access the application. You never would know that unless you tested that. And so I think your invocation name, similarly to how you think about like naming your application on Google Play or on the App Store, also plays into how people discover. So even things as like trying to think about naming your skill very literally, like how someone would actually request for that thing, might be an easy way of just skipping that line a little bit in discoverability. And other ways as well, to Joan's point, like people don't have the patience to say a voice query and hear an entire page worth of results. They hear probably the first three and no more than that and choose up that. And I think that's going to be even more competitive, where we're not just competing for first page analytics anymore. We're competing for top three, or ideally the very first one. So it'll be interesting.
And this is also playing into product naming. We talked about sonic branding, but I think especially with, you mentioned phonetics, which not all of my colleagues think about, phonemes and how what we say actually matches up with, words and pieces, like phonics, back in the day with little kids, but really think about pieces of words and can it be understood reliably? And if the name of your product cannot be understood reliably, you may consider a new product name. If it's really, really important to be understood, and the competition is fierce. So I've heard a lot of brands practicing, testing things out, trying lots of different names with legal and so forth. But I think really into the future, that's going to be more and more a thing, because the Ubers of the world, the Twitch, you really want to make sure that your brand might look cool on paper, but does it sound right? Is it going to be picked up?
But this has been great. I mean, you can keep going all different avenues. You start talking about KPIs. There's all sorts of things that'd be great to dive into. Just watching the time here, perhaps. And first, I wanted to say again, thanks for being part of this. This has been. I've learned a lot just listening to both of you, and I think folks will find it very helpful. Perhaps just as like a final thought. If you could share, where do you see voice going, or what do you think might need to happen for voice interfaces to take off more in the future? And we can wrap up on that.
Future of voice. Wow, Artie. Okay, the future of voice as I see it is not voice only, it's integrated.
How about yourself, Emily?
That was like a nice one-liner. The future of voice, I think, is going to be embedded in creating brand new ways of interaction, brand new ways of communication. And I think in order for us to get there, there needs to be, number one, more device adoption and also variety. I think that we treat a lot of smart devices like speakers because they look like speakers. And we ask them to play music because they look like they play music. So it's how do we also start to create platforms that look like they can do other things? Because I think that will also help. And also, how can these voice AIs start to play better amongst each other? So instead of having to choose one AI to do it all, how can we start to think about calling AIs for what they're best known for? So using Google because it's the best for discoverability, searchability, or rankings, versus, let's say, Amazon that might know your shopping behavior better for quick purchases. So how can you do that flipping in the same way?
And what do you think, Artie? I'm curious. What's your answer to that question?
I think, like any new ecosystem, there's issues with user acquisition, discovery, monetization. That's some of the areas that need improvement, especially the monetization side for some set of brands, depending on what their use case is. But I think you see maybe media companies and related to that, like seeing some form of monetization would be helpful. But again, this has been great. It's definitely really interesting hearing from you. And so thanks for being part of this. We had Joan from Versa and Emily from VoiceFlow.